Hi, welcome back to biology. My name is Mr. Kubuske, and this is biology class here at Cathedral High School in Indianapolis. We've been talking about evolution, and basically we started off with the formation of everything that we kind of need to have life on this planet, and we ended up last time talking about life on this planet. So now we're going to start to talk about how life changes. We're really going to get into the story of evolution. So let's pick up where we kind of left off by talking about what evolution is. So evolution, the idea of evolution, is any change in the heritable traits within a population over generations. Now, this can be physical characteristics. It can also be behaviors and ways of going about surviving in an ecosystem that you may be found yourself in. So that's not necessarily an idea that's new, and this isn't necessarily anything that started with Darwin, who we're going to talk about here in a second, which I'm sure is a name that you know. So again, this is just the idea that we recognize that changes have occurred, and so really what we're going to start to talk about is how did it occur? Like, what are the mechanisms behind it? So before we do that, we're going to talk about some things that are irrefutable, and these are things that, in other words, that scientists have all agreed upon, no matter what mechanism you believe in, like actually causes the changes. These things everyone kind of agrees upon. So the first one is the idea of common descent. In other words, that all living things on this planet are connected. In other words, we have all come from the same place. Now, if we're talking about humans, we're all primates. So we all have primate ancestors. If we're talking about all mammals, then we have a mammal ancestor, a little rodent-like creature that survived during dinosaur times. So in other words, you can take everything back, all the way back to a common ancestor. In other words, when you hear the phrase, oh, the humans evolved from monkeys, well, that's not necessarily true. We have a common ancestor. So there's a point in our history, in our lineage, where we were once the same thing, not necessarily a monkey, but some type of primate. And then over time that we split off into two different species, one becoming monkeys and apes and things like that, and one becoming human beings. In fact, believe it or not, monkeys are actually a little bit further away from us than you want to believe. Chimpanzees and some of the other great apes are our closer relatives. But again, so in other words, you are related to the banana that you had for breakfast this morning. You're related to the bacteria that's crawling on your face. You are related to the person you're sitting next to, okay? Whatever it may be. Now, how closely related you are has to do with how far back that lineage goes, but we'll talk more about that when we talk about phylogeny here at the end. Okay, so second part, descent with modification. In other words, you are a descendant of your parents, and you are sculpted from them, and you have traits from both of your parents that make you unique. You are really similar to your parents, and you're really similar to your offspring, but you are still unique and different, and you have advantages or disadvantages based on that uniqueness. And so common descent and descent with modification are things that the scientists have pretty much agreed upon as theories of evolution, that we know these have occurred. What we don't necessarily know is what's the mechanism driving the changes that we're seeing that cause this evolution. And so we're going to talk about two theories about how evolution can occur. The first one came to us from a guy by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was a French naturalist. When we say the word naturalist, think like ecologist. And in 1801, that's right, at the turn of the 19th century, he proposed the first driving force behind evolution that he called acquired characteristics. And he based his theory on the life of the giraffe. And so here's the story that he told in his paper, basically. He said, let's say one day there was a hungry horse, and that the only food that was left to this horse was at a little bit higher than he could reach on treetops. Well, in order to survive, he really needed that food, and so what did he do? Well, he walked up to that food, and he stretched and stretched and stretched, and his neck grew just a little bit longer from stretching each day, and then he was able to get that food. And then he'd have to go back, and he'd have to stretch even higher to get the higher food, and his neck would stretch again over time, and keep going like that on and on and on throughout his life. And then he would pass those traits on to his kids, and they would have to do the same things, and so on and so forth, until, after generations, we got ourselves a giraffe. Makes sense, right? Well, there's a big problem with this theory of evolution, and I'm sure you could probably figure out what it is. So Lamarck's theory is based on acquired characteristics. In other words, whatever you get during your lifetime, you then pass that on to your kids. The problem is that he didn't take genetics necessarily into consideration, but you got to give him credit. Genetics wasn't necessarily a field that people were studying at this time. In fact, nuclein, which we later learned was DNA, isn't even going to be discovered for another 65 years compared to what we're looking at here. So it really isn't a bad theory for the time, but now we know there's obviously some holes in it. For example, let's say I want to go bulk up, even more than I already am, right? And so I become, pretty swollen and I'll walk around like this, and then I go to have kids. Well, because I have changed myself to look like this, that means my kids are going to come out basically looking the same way. The problem with that, obviously, is that we know that your genes are what determine what your offspring are going to look like and give you advantages and disadvantages. And it's not necessarily how you change yourself during your lifetime. It'd be like saying if I dye my hair blue and then have kids, my kids are going to have blue hair. It doesn't work like that. Okay? So then how does it work? What is the story that works? Well, let's talk about a guy by the name of Charles Darwin.
Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, was a naturalist, someone who studies nature. At the start of his career, he traveled the world by ship, collecting and documenting plants and animals. During his travels, Darwin became very interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contain species of plants and animals unique to those islands. They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises on the Galapagos Islands can be distinguished from those of Africa. Meanwhile, with the exception of size, they're almost identical to a species found nearby in South America. Darwin believed these similarities could be best explained.
Well, let's pause right there. We'll talk about how they could be best explained here in a second. But before we get to that, let's talk about Darwin himself. So Darwin was an English naturalist. Believe it or not, he was actually a med school dropout, but that's neither here nor there. So he was interested in studying the world. He wanted to travel the world more than anything else, and he really was interested in nature. And so he hopped aboard a ship, which we'll talk about the ship here in a second, and he did a lot of reading and did some studying and took notes on the different things that he saw during his life, during his experiences on this ship. But what's important to note is the things that Darwin was influenced by. So he was influenced by the idea of common descent, which we mentioned before. He was influenced by the idea of biogeography. In other words, why do we see certain types of species, or even the same species of animals and plants on certain parts of the world? Like, why does that occur? He was influenced by Lamarck, like most scientists and especially naturalists at the time were. And he was also influenced by this idea of artificial selection. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So what exactly is artificial selection? Well, believe it or not, you're pretty used to artificial selection. So artificial selection is how farmers, and really human beings overall, cultivate livestock or cultivate crops. It's how we, take the things that we want from those crops and we reproduce them in other versions of that same crop, or recreate it into different versions of the same crop. Let me show you this video, and it might better explain how this works.
For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals, and through the process of selective breeding, have sculpted the original wild forms into new domestic forms, much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces 100 seeds, most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent plant. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to disease, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued, thicker, sweeter leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next crop, small positive changes will add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to hear that broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel. The evolution of this original plant into all the varieties we see today was carefully guided by different farmers around the world who simply selected for different traits. It's important to note that the farmer doesn't actually create anything. Random descent with modification creates new traits. The farmer simply chooses which of those new creations are allowed to reproduce and which are not.
There you go. So you'll notice the title of that last slide, wolves, dogs, and farm animals. Like this is how human beings, created the dog. The dog is not a naturally occurring species on this planet. We sculpted the creation of our breeds of dogs from wolves. In other words, we chose the traits best suited for our advantage, and we allowed those wolves to reproduce and eventually became the dog breeds that we know and love today. So Darwin, like I said, hops aboard this ship called the HMS Beagle, and he travels around the world with them. Now they're traders, and they're doing their regular stuff. He's just kind of along for the ride. It's not like this is a ship that he is guiding. It's got its own job to do. He just kind of hops along. And at each stop along the way, when they would pick up or drop off their loads or whatever they needed to do, he would get out and he would kind of tour around and he'd take note of the different plants and animal species that he saw there. And one of the places they stopped was a place called the Galapagos Islands, which is found just off the coast of Ecuador. It's a little chain, a little couple of islands. And so, as we start to think about the Galapagos Islands, let me tell you a quick story. Once upon a time, there's a species of finch that lived on the coast of Ecuador, and they were kind of angry birds. So no, that's not true. They were happy birds. Look how nice they are. Okay. One day, a small group of those finches, they're out flying around looking for food, and they get blown away from a storm. They get kind of driven off their course, and they see land in the distance, so they think that's home, so they go and land there. Well, where they land wasn't exactly Ecuador. In fact, it was this group of islands called the Galapagos Islands. So they land on the Galapagos Islands, and here they found no predators. They found plenty of food. They found beautiful weather. And it was a paradise, really, a finch paradise. Why would they want to leave? Look how happy they are. Oh, God, that's creepy. Let's get off there. Okay? So if they decide to stay here on this island, what do you think will happen to their population? Well, it's not hard to figure out.
A good example of this can be seen in a group of finches living on a remote island. They are some of the most famous animals in the world of science and are known as Darwin finches after their discoverer, Charles Darwin. And this is the story of those finches. A few hundred years ago, a small group of finches was blown onto the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the Pacific, probably by a big storm. The finches found themselves in an environment that was completely new to them, a real finch paradise, an abundance of food, and no predators. They reproduced rapidly and numerously. The islands were soon heaving with finches. This meant that food supplies became increasingly scarce. The finch paradise was threatened with famine, and finch friends became competitors. This is when selection intervened. Their individuality and small differences, in this case their slightly different beaks, meant that some of the birds were able to avoid competing with their fellow finches. The beaks of some of the finches were more suitable for digging for worms. Other finches were able to use their beaks better for cracking seeds. The finches consequently sought out ecological niches. In these niches, they were safe from excessive competition. They soon began to mate primarily with other finches that used the same niche. Over the course of many generations, these characteristics were enhanced, enabling the finches to exploit their niches successfully. The differences between the worm diggers and the seed crackers became so large that they were no longer able to mate with one another. Different species emerged as a result. Today, there are 14 different species of finch living on the Galapagos Islands, all of which are descended from the same group of stranded finches. This is how new species are created by evolution.
So there you go. So these Galapagos Islands are home to dozens of different species that again look a lot like the species on the mainland, but at the same time they're unique because they're best suited to their new environment here on the Galapagos Islands. So the best example again of the
Long
finches
ago,
and the
a tortoise from the mainland may have drifted to the islands, possibly on a raft of storm debris, and once arriving, laid her eggs. Random changes caused by descent with modification over thousands of years eventually transformed the island creatures and the mainland creatures so much that they could no longer be considered the same species. This idea made good sense to Darwin, except for one thing. The island creatures he found weren't just randomly different from their mainland cousins. They were specially adapted for island life. The Galapagos is a collection of 18 main islands, many of which are home to tortoises. The larger islands have lots of grass and vegetation. Tortoises there grow extra heavy and have dome-like shells. Some of the smaller islands have very little grass, forcing the tortoises to feed on island cactus. The best cactus pads grow on the tops of these plants. Fortunately, tortoises on these islands are equipped with expanded front legs and saddle-like shells, allowing them to stretch their necks.
So, and I'm sorry I'm cutting it short, but we're running short on time. So Darwin's going to take these ideas and he's going to formulate his theory of natural selection, which we will talk about next time.